Chapter 1. Mrs. Rachel Lynde is surprised. Mrs. Rachel Lynde lives just where the Avalia main road dipped down into a little hollow, fringed with elders and ladies' eardrops and transported by a book that had its source away back in the woods of the old Cuthbert place. It was reputed to be an intricate, heading along brook in its earlier course through those woods, with dark secrets of pool and cascade, but by the time it reached Linda's Hollow, it was quite well conducted. Little stream, for not even a brook could run past Mrs. Rachel Linda's door without due regard for decency and decorum. It probably was conscious that Mrs. Rachel was sitting at her window, keeping a sharp eye on everything that passed from brooks and children up, and that if she noticed anything odd or out of place, she would never rest until she had ferreted out the whys and wherefores thereof. There are plenty of people in Avalia and out of it who can attend closely to their neighborhood's business by dint of neglecting their own, but Mrs. Rachel Lynde was one of those capable creatures who can manage their own concerns and those of other folks into the bargain. She was notable housewife, and her work always done and well done. She ran the sewing circle, helped run the Sunday school, and was the strongest prom of the Church Aid Society and Foreign Missions Auxiliary. Yet, with all this, Mrs. Rachel found abundant time to sit for hours at her kitchen window knitting cotton warp quilt. She had knitted 16 of them, as Avonlea housekeepers were wont to tell in voices, and keeping a sharp eye on the main road that crossed the hollow and wound up the steep red hill beyond. Since Avalia occupied a little triangle peninsula jutting out into the Gulf of St. Lawrence with water on two sides of it, anybody who went out of it or into it had to pass over that hill road, and so run the unseen gauntlet of Mrs. Rachel's all-seeing eye. She was sitting there one afternoon in early June. The sun was coming in at the window warm and bright. The orchard on the slope below the house was in brittle fresh, a pinky-white bloom, hummed over by a myriad of bees. Thomas Lynde, a meek little man whom Avalia people called Rachel Lynde's husband, was sowing his late turnip seed on the hill field beyond the barn, and Matthew Cuthbert ought to have been sowing his on the big red brook field away over the Green Gables. Mrs. Rachel knew that he ought because she had heard him tell Peter Morrison that evening before in William J. Blair's store over at Garmony that he meant to sow his turnip seed the next afternoon. Peter had asked him, of course, for Matthew Cuthbert had never been known to volunteer information about anything in his whole life. And yet here was Matthew Cuthbert at 3:30 on the afternoon of a busy day, placidly driving over the hollow and up the hill. Moreover, he wore a white collar and his best suit of clothes, which was plain proof that he was going out of Avonlea, and he had the budgie and the sorrel more, which betokened that he was going a considerable distance. Now, where was Matthew Cuthbert going, and why was he going there? Had it been any other man in Avonlea, Mrs. Rachel, deftly putting this and that together, might have given a pretty good guess as to both questions, but Matthew so early went from home that it must be something pressing and unusual which was taking him. He was the shiniest man alive and hated to have to go among strangers to any place where he might have to talk. Matthew, dressed up with a white collar and driving in a buggy, was something that didn't happen often. Mr. Rachel pondered as she might, could make nothing of it, and her afternoon enjoyment was spoiled. I will just step over to Green Gables after tea and find out from Marilla where she's gone and why, the worthy woman finally concluded. He doesn't generally go to town this time of year, and he never visits. If he'd run out of turnip seed, he wouldn't dress up, take the buggy to go for more. He wasn't driving fast enough to be going for a doctor. Yet something must have happened since last night to start him off. I'm clean puzzled, that's what, and I won't know a minute's peace of mind or conscience until I know what has taken Matthew Cuthbert out of Avonlea today. Accordingly, after tea, Mrs. Rachel set out. She had not far to go. The big rambling orchard-embowered house where the Cuthbert lived was a scant quarter of a mile up the road from Linda's Hollow. To be sure, the long lane made it a good deal further. Matthew Cuthbert's father, as shy and silent as his son after him, had got as far away as he possibly could from the fellow man without actually retreating into the woods when he founded his homestead. Green Gables were built at the further edge of his cleared land, and it was to this day barely visible from the main road, along which all the other Avonlea houses were so sociable streeted. Mrs. Rachel Linde did not call living in such a place living at all. It's just staying, that's what, she said as she stepped along the deep-rooted grass lane bordered with wild rose bushes. It's no wonder Matthew and Marilla are both a little odd, living away back here by themselves. Trees aren't much company, though dear knows if there'd be enough of them. I'd rather look at people, to be sure. They seem contented enough, but then I suppose they are used to it. A body can get used to anything, even to being hanged, as the Irishman said. With this, Mrs. Rachel stepped out of the lane into the backyard of Green Gables. Very green and neat and precise was that yard, set about on one side with great patriarchal willows, and the other with prim Lombardies. Not a stray stick nor stone was to be seen, for Mrs. Rachel would have seen if there had been. Probably she was of the opinion that Marilla Cuthbert was swept that yard over as often as she swept her house. One could have eaten a meal off the ground without overbrimming the proverbial packed up dirt. Mrs. Rachel rapped smartly at the kitchen door and stepped in when bidden to do so. The kitchen at Green Gables was a cheerful apartment, or would have been cheerful if it had not been so painfully clean as to give it something of the appearance of an unusual parlor. Its window looked east and west. Through the west one, looking out on the backyard, came a flood of mellow June sunlight. But the east one, whence you got a glimpse of the bloom-white cherry trees in the left orchard and nodding. Slender birches down in the hollow by the brook was screened over by a tangle of vines. Here sat Marilla Cuthbert, But when she sat at all, always slightly distrustful of sunshine, which seemed to her dancing and irresponsible, a thing for a word which was meant to be taken seriously. And here she sat now, knitting, and the table behind her was laid for supper. Mrs. Rachel, before she had fairly closed the door, had taken a mental note of everything that was on that table. There were 3 plates laid, so that Marilla must be expecting someone home with Matthew to eat, but the dishes were every dishes, and there was only crab apple preserves and one kind of cake, so that the expected company could not be any particular company. But Matthew's white collar and the subtle mar, Mrs. Rachel was getting fairly dizzy with this unusual mystery about quiet, mysterious Green Gables. Good evening, Rachel, Marilla said briskly. This is a real fine evening, isn't it? Won't you sit down? How are all your folks? Something that, for lack of any other name, might be called friendship exists and always had existed between Marilla Cuthbert and Mrs. Rachel in spite of, or perhaps because of their dissimilarity. Marilla was tall, thin woman with angles and without curves. Her dark hair showed some gray streaks and was always twisted up in a hard little knot behind 2 wire hairpins struck aggressively through it. She looked like a woman of narrow experience and rigid conscience, which she was, but there was a saving something about her mouth which, if it had been ever so slightly developed, might have been considered indicative of a sense of humor.